Welcome to Voxrupt.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we sift through the sources to bring you the insights that truly matter. Today we're plunging into the fascinating and, well, often polarizing world of Karl Marx.
Yeah, it really is remarkable.
I mean, a figure from the 19th century, still igniting such passionate debates, still popping up on university syllabi. Why? Why does his influence persist, and what does he actually offer us in our, incredibly complex 21st century world?
That's precisely what we're here to explore today. This deep dive, it's really going to critically examine Marx's enduring presence in Western thought. But maybe more importantly, we'll scrutinize his theories for their applicability, or maybe their lack of it, to non-Western societies.
Right.
And we're going to focus quite a bit on the rich Iranian narrative and identity. It's a really compelling counterexample.
Okay, so our mission is pretty ambitious then. We're going to try and unpack the various ways Marx is interpreted today, dive into the foundational ideas that shaped his entire worldview. We'll challenge some of his big historical claims, and ultimately ask, does his framework really help us understand the diverse tapestry of human experiences, especially beyond Western capitalism?
Exactly. We want to uncover why, for some civilizations, the path to true self-understanding might mean moving, beyond Marx altogether.
So let's start right there. What's striking is how Marx continues to be taught in Western universities today. He's often presented not as some failed prophet, but as a philosopher with relevant insights into capitalism's crises, its power structures. He's not just dismissed.
No, not at all. And it's a curious persistence, isn't it?
It really is.
Our sources suggest this continued presence might actually say less about the universal validity of Marx's original economic theories and maybe more about the West's own ongoing ideological struggles.
Ah, interesting. So his role in academia has shifted.
Absolutely. Hugely. He seems to have evolved from being seen as like the architect of revolution to now more of a resource for cultural critique. You'll find his work used for power analysis, for deconstructing social structures, and across a really wide range of departments, philosophy, art history, you name it.
And that's tied to cultural leftism, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's often linked to what's called cultural leftism, where Marx becomes this kind of tool for interrogating race, gender, language, identity. He's become less an economic theorist, maybe, and more a symbol of critical inquiry itself.
That cultural shift is really fascinating. It does make you wonder, is this academic embrace of Marx truly about his enduring economic relevance, or is something else going on? Because many argue this return to Marx is actually a bit of an illusion, maybe a symptom of the left's struggle to offer practical, tangible alternatives to the current system.
Right, and unlike 20th century Marxism, this cultural leftism often focuses more on identity politics, linguistic deconstruction, rather than actual economic revolution.
Which then leads us to a pretty crucial insight, maybe.
Yeah.
That in this modern context, Marx isn't so much an answer, but perhaps a symptom of what some sources are calling the West's philosophical exhaustion.
That's a strong phrase, philosophical exhaustion.
It is. Like a civilization wrestling with the meaning of life within capitalism and struggling to find a viable, compelling alternative to liberalism. He ends up serving as a powerful question about justice and power, maybe, rather than a definitive solution.
That's a really powerful observation. Okay, so if his contemporary influence isn't purely economic, what was the foundational philosophy? What drove Marx's thinking in the first place?
Let's dive into that. His core materialist worldview is really key to understanding everything else.
Okay.
So unlike German idealists like Hegel, Marx interpreted the world through matter, not abstract ideas. For him, human history is fundamentally shaped by material forces, economic relations. It effectively reduces man, you could argue, to a laboring animal, defined by how and what he produces.
And what's crucial to grasp here is that while he adopted Hegel's idea of the dialectic, that process of opposing forces leading to a new synthesis.
Right. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Exactly. Marx famously flipped it. He transposed it from the realm of idea to matter, believing it pushed history inevitably towards a classless society. But, and this is a big but, this philosophical foundation is marked by what critics call radical reductionism. Meaning it largely excludes anything subjective, spiritual, or cultural from serious historical analysis. Things like myth, religion, art, even language. They're often dismissed as just superstructures.
Superstructures, like they're just built on top of the economic base.
Precisely. Lacking any independent, intrinsic value of their own. They're just reflections of the economy, essentially.
That's a strong point. And it really highlights a profound reduction in his view of humanity itself. It's what some critics call an ontological reduction of the human.
Ontological reduction.
Yeah, where in Marxist thought, the human is fundamentally an economic entity. His famous line, man's social being determines his consciousness, really illustrates this.
It does.
It kind of strips humans of their vast existential complexity, seeing consciousness, ethics, religion, even love as simply functions of one's economic position.
Indeed. And the absence of the spiritual, the cultural, the mythic in this framework is, well, it's quite glaring when you look closely. Marxism's understanding of history really struggles to grasp the profound mythic dimension of human experience.
Right. Myths are just tools of class domination. Religion is the famous opium of the masses.
Exactly. And this perspective becomes profoundly inadequate, maybe even distorting when we try to understand civilizations like Iran, for instance.
Because Iran is so deeply intertwined with myths, spiritual traditions, historical memory.
Precisely. It just makes it impossible to really comprehend pivotal figures like the poet Ferdowsi or the mystic Hafez through a purely economic lens. You miss so much.
Okay, so if this is his foundational worldview, this kind of materialist reductionism, how does that play out in his grand theory of history? Does it simplify his famous idea of class struggle?
Well, let's look at that. Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, famously declared that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. It's one of his most quoted lines.
Right. It sounds sweeping, definitive.
It does. But when we connect it to the bigger picture we've been discussing, many critics view it as a reductive simplification. It tends to gloss over the huge civilizational, cultural, and psychological complexities that truly shape historical experience.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about figures like Pharaoh and Moses or Caesar and Christ. Can their conflicts really be boiled down just to economic class divisions? It feels like there's so much more going on there. Religion, power, ideology.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And this purely economic approach really falters when you try to apply it to massive cultural shifts, like the European Renaissance or the scientific revolution, or even modern movements like feminism. They're driven by far more than just economic factors.
And the problem gets even deeper when we try to apply this framework outside the West, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Marx's analysis, some argue, exhibits a kind of cultural colorblindness in places like India, Iran, China, the Arab world. Social structures are often primarily organized around religion, ethnicity, language, deeply held traditions.
Like India's historical caste system, perhaps, or tribal affiliations in the Arab world.
Exactly. Those identities and structures are often much more powerful than solely class. And it's worth noting, even in the West today, identity-based movements around race, gender, sexuality have often displaced class as the primary way people understand social conflict.
That brings up an important point. Using Iranian history as a specific counterexample, how does it challenge the class struggle framework?
Well, when you look at Iranian history, it powerfully illustrates the inadequacy, really. Major Iranian revolutions like the uprising of Mokhtar, the Constitutional Revolution, even the 1979 revolution, they were fundamentally rooted in things like indigenous myths, deep religious beliefs, a powerful sense of national identity, not just economic class.
So the drivers were different.
Very different. And think about legendary figures like Hafez, Saadi, Ferdowsi, Rumi. They're revered as carriers of spiritual depth, of national identity. They're not just seen as intellectuals of the oppressed class.
No, of course not.
So applying Marx's framework there, it really distorts Iranian history. It kind of reduces it to a flawed replica of Europe missing its unique essence.
Okay, we've dissected Marx's core ideas, and we've seen where critics argue his worldview falls short, theoretically. But what happens when these grand theories move from paper to practice?
Yes, when Marxism leaves the classroom and enters the real world. That's where the stark realities often emerge. Because while Marxism promised liberation, an end to oppression, its practical application in the 20th century, time and time again, unfortunately led to systems that were totalitarian, repressive, and frankly, profoundly anti-human.
We could see this pretty vividly in the Soviet Union, right? Under figures like Lenin and Stalin. Marxism was fundamentally transformed into a system of brutal state control. And this led directly to forced labor camps, the gulags, widespread political purges.
And the Communist Party itself became a new kind of ruling elite, ironically replacing the old one.
Yeah, exactly. And the pattern wasn't unique to Russia.
No, sadly not. In China, Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution caused mass deaths, immense destitution. And Marxism there fused with almost quasi-religious and cult-like elements, leading to this iron grip of ideological tyranny.
And Cuba.
Similarly, in Cuba, Fidel Castro established a one-party system marked by repression, abolished the free press, private property, creating what became a very closed society, often plagued by economic inefficiency.
So in these major examples, the theoretical promise of liberation seemed to result in a very real and often very brutal new form of domination.
That's the tragic irony highlighted by many critics. And the economic consequences were often just as devastating.
Right, the centrally planned economies.
They consistently resulted in inefficiency, corruption, and ultimately, often economic collapse.
Like Soviet five-year plans.
Exactly. Infamously riddled with falsified statistics, producing poor quality goods, leading to chronic shortages of basic necessities, which ultimately contributed to the Soviet economic collapse by the 1980s.
And in China, before Deng Xiaoping's reforms introduced market elements.
The state-run economies suffered terribly from famine and stagnation. Significant growth only really came after that partial pragmatic return to market mechanisms.
In Cuba, heavily reliant on Soviet support, faced that dire special period after the USSR collapsed.
Marked by widespread poverty, severe food shortages, it really demonstrates the practical difficulties. These grand experiments in planned economies often ended up, you could say, equally distributing poverty.
Beyond the economics, though, what about the individual?
That's another critical area. These Marxist regimes frequently suppress the individual, viewing personal autonomy, independent thought, as a direct threat to the collective.
We saw that in the Soviet Union with art and literature, forced to serve socialist realism.
Right. Writers like Solzhenitsyn exiled or imprisoned simply for their views, for expressing dissent.
And you saw similar patterns elsewhere.
In China and Cuba, absolutely. Severe restrictions on freedom of expression, media, universities. Everything under strict party control.
So the overarching message from history seems to be that Marxism in practice, whatever its intentions, often ended up annihilating freedom, stifling creativity, and erasing individuality.
Which is a profound contradiction to its theoretical promises of human emancipation. And this leads us to another, perhaps related, significant blind spot in Marx's theory, his understanding of culture, and relatedly, the place of womanhood.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, as we touched on, he relegated culture to the superstructure. He argued it was basically just a reflection of the economic base.
Right, stripping intrinsic meaning from myth, language, art, historical memory.
Exactly. For him, these were primarily instruments of class domination. He simply couldn't seem to comprehend why nations would protect cherished traditions, their cultural heritage, even when facing economic hardship. There wasn't a category for that intrinsic value.
And this becomes a really critical fault line when you think about Iranian identity again.
Precisely. Because Iranian identity is so profoundly rooted in myth, religion, that rich poetic tradition, deep historical memory, think of epic figures like Kate Khosrow, the spiritual significance of Ashura, the beauty of the Persian language, the enduring wisdom of Hafez.
Things that don't fit the economic base model easily.
Not at all.
Sure.
So Marxism, by ignoring these fundamental elements, largely fails as a viable narrative for Iran. It leads to what some call analytical alienation, treating Iran not as its own unique civilization, but as sort of an incomplete replica of Europe.
And his opposition to tradition and religion was quite explicit, wasn't it?
Oh, very. He famously saw religion as the opium of the masses, and tradition as basically an obstruction to revolutionary change.
And when that antagonism was put into practice.
It led directly to the destruction of civilizational pillars in many Marxist regimes. We saw churches shuttered, temples destroyed, cultural heritage suppressed, all in the name of progress, of breaking from the past.
Okay, and what about the place of women in Marxist theory? You mentioned that was related.
Yes. What's crucial to understand here is that Marx primarily portrays women as part of the labor force, rather than as autonomous historical subjects in their own right.
So no independent theory of gender or female subjectivity.
Largely no. He effectively reduces women, critics argue, to potential laborers, or sort of functions within the system of production.
Which means what for understanding women's roles historically?
It means he was largely incapable of grasping the profound civilizational, cultural, and mythic roles women have played throughout history.
Can you give examples from Iran again?
Sure. In Iranian history, you have figures like a Zarmadakht, a Sassanian queen and warrior, Or the poets Parvinata Sami and Tahiri Kurat al-Ain. These were women who were powerful carriers of meaning, cultural architects, not merely biological producers or economic units.
That weren't just defined by their labor.
Not at all, but Marx viewed history predominantly through this masculine economic class-based lens, and that inevitably diminished women's rich contributions, their unique experiences.
This then brings up an important point for a broader feminist critique, doesn't it?
It does. While Marxist feminism attempted to integrate gender analysis, it often arguably reproduced Marx's core reductionism. It frequently saw women primarily through the lens of domestic workers or cheap labor.
As opposed to other feminist movements.
Right. In contrast, other feminist movements placed a much stronger emphasis on lived experience, on the independent female narrative, on subjectivity. So the critique of Marx from a feminist perspective really highlights his theory's fundamental inability, some argue, to truly understand the human being, half of whom is woman, and half of history written by her.
So after all this, where are we left? What is the true legacy of Marx in our contemporary world? Is he still dynamically alive, or has he been quietly archived?
That's the big question, isn't it? There has been a noticeable symbolic resurgence of Marx in Western academic and intellectual circles, especially after the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah, I remember headlines like Marx for the 21st century.
Exactly. But what's truly interesting here, and what many sources point out, is that this return appears to be more cultural, more symbolic than genuinely revolutionary in the old sense.
How so?
Well, the so-called New Left today largely no longer seeks a proletarian revolution in the traditional Marxist sense. Instead, its focus is much more on social justice, minority rights, climate change.
And Marx gets used differently.
Right. He gets selectively appropriated, often as a source of structural critique for these new causes, rather than a blueprint for overthrowing capitalism wholesale.
So, in truth, maybe the New Left has largely moved beyond him in a practical sense.
Many argue exactly that. You see Marx's ideas blended with psychoanalysis, linguistics, postmodernism, in ways that often diverge significantly from his original core theory.
Like with postmodern thinkers, Foucault, Lyotard.
Precisely. They largely reject Marx's grand, overarching historical narrative, his meta-narrative. They prefer to see history as a complex web of discourses, not a single engine of class struggle.
And what about neo-Marxists? Like Althusser, Marcuse, Zizek.
They attempted these sophisticated syntheses, trying to update Marx, but often, by their very nature, these attempts distance them from Marx's original texts, creating something new.
And the cultural leftists we mentioned earlier.
They've largely transformed Marx into a tool for critiquing race, gender, language with identity, often displacing class as the central point of analysis. It's a very different focus.
So this all boils down to a profound question. Is Marx truly still alive as a driving force in the world? Or is he merely archived?
It's provocative, isn't it? He is certainly taught, he's cited, his books are on the shelves, but he no longer appears to be a genuine threat to the existing order in the way he once was, or a direct inspiration for uprising in the streets.
So museologized.
That's the term some use. Museologized, like a relic in a museum, a relic of a past that can no longer truly shape the future. Residing in libraries and lecture halls, perhaps, but largely absent from the actual struggles and aspirations of everyday life for many.
He lives in the minds of intellectuals, maybe,
Yeah.
but not necessarily in the hearts and movements of ordinary people anymore.
That could be one way to put it.
Okay, so to recap our deep dive today, we've seen that despite his grand claims, his enduring academic presence, Marx often seems confined by a largely Western, maybe dualistic framework. And this limits his ability to truly explain and maybe liberate, especially when applied to civilizations like Iran, whose realities just don't fit neatly into his economic or class-based boxes.
Which really emphasizes the imperative, doesn't it? The need to construct an independent narrative for civilizations like Iran.
Independent how?
One that arises organically from their own rich history, their indigenous myths, their poetic language, their unique forms of cultural resistance, rather than relying on imported Western frameworks, whether Marxist or otherwise.
Precisely. It means rereading history, maybe, with our own tools.
Your own tools. I like that.
History shouldn't just be understood through documents and economic analysis, as important as those are, but deeply through poetry, myth, ritual, the living memory of a people.
Because those are crucial tools for understanding meaning, identity.
Exactly. And imported lenses, however well-intentioned, can inadvertently distort history and even alienate a people from their own sense of self.
that brings us to a final, perhaps provocative thought for you, our listener.
Go.
To truly move beyond Marx, in this broader sense we've been discussing, might mean moving beyond a theoretical dependency on the West altogether. It's perhaps about cultivating the courage to create new concepts, to redefine what it means to be human, to understand history, womanhood, culture, civilization, from truly diverse indigenous perspectives.
So this pursuit of intellectual sovereignty, it isn't about denying other ideas.
Not at all. It's more like a transcendence, a path to liberation from maybe ill-fitting foreign theories and a profound return to self.
So we leave you with this thought. What other dominant narratives, Western or otherwise, might also be limiting your understanding of the world? And what might it mean for you, personally or collectively, to courageously look beyond them?